Our scripture reading this morning is from the book of Deuteronomy. Buried within this passage from Deuteronomy is one of those phrases that you often see on bumper stickers or otherwise quoted without context. Choose life. But as we know, context in the Bible always matters and usually suggests that things are more often complex than simple. Here, Moses is nearing the end of his life, and the Lord tells him to gather the people of Israel as they prepare for a new leader and the crossing over into the promised land after 40 years of exile in Egypt. The exhortation from God to the people is as they are about to embark on a new stage in life. And Moses tells them that they must choose what they will value, choose their way of life. As we hear these words today, we ask what God is asking us to choose. The reading from Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 to 20. Surely this commandment that I am commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. It is not in heaven that you should say, "Who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us, so that we may hear it and observe it?" Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, "Who will cross to the other side of the sea for us and get it for us, so that we may hear it and observe it?" No, the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Thanks be to God for these words of life.
Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Our sermon title this day comes from the really critically important cultural landmark, the best-selling girl group chart topper of all time, the Spice Girls' Wannabe. You may recall that it was sung primarily by Mel B with Jerry Halliwell and who was Sporty Spice rapping on it. It was coming out in 1996-97. It was the first single for the Spice Girls, this British pop band, and it is in fact not a particularly deep song at all. But in numerous studies, it has been ranked the most catchy song of all time. And part of it is, tell me what you want, what you really, really want. Another critical lyric is zig a zig ah. So again, it's really deep. But it's been stuck in my head all week, and there is something worthwhile to it other than being particularly catchy. The singers, the women, are promoting the importance of female friendship over and against romantic bonds. They suggest that it is important. Friendship never ends, but if you want to be with me, you got to get with my friends. If you are going to be with me, there are things that you need to know. Friendship over and against a romantic bond need not be an either or, but the women saying you should choose how you will care for me. Choose how you will approach our relationship, my history, my world. There is always a way to choose how to be in the world. Now, it's hard to imagine something farther removed from the pop stylings of a group of young British women in the late 1990s than the speech given by Moses to the people of God some 3,000 years later. But both suggest that people, individuals and communities, are endowed with the ability to make choices, to choose how they will live into relationships, to choose how they will act to shape their common destiny. As Diane noted, the people of Israel have been exiled in the wilderness for 40 years after being liberated from slavery in Egypt. I was struck as a kid finally looking at a map of the Middle East and noting how far it is from Egypt to the land that became Israel. It is hundreds of miles, definitely, maybe even 1,000 or more, but even on foot with a big caravan of people, it shouldn't have taken 40 years. Why, then, have they been prevented from arriving in the Promised Land? When I was a kid, I had a keychain that said, because even back then, Moses and men wouldn't stop to ask for directions. But that was not the reason in the Bible also, for a host of reasons, in fact, not least of which is God's sense that they do not yet fully understand what it means to be faithful, what it means to live as God's people in their freedom. And so God uses Moses and this time to teach them, to give them the law, and to instruct and exhort them to choose the way of God, to choose the way of life. As Diane also noted, if you've heard or seen a bit of this passage at all outside of worship or Bible study, it was most likely on a bumper sticker, "Choose life." Or maybe it was even on a protest poster. Some American Christians have a sense that these verses from Deuteronomy map rather neatly onto a contemporary political battle surrounding medical practice and a 1973 Supreme Court ruling. But as we love to say around here, the truth is slightly more complicated than that. What does it mean to choose life? I think it has something to do with the resurrection virtue. We've been doing our series in these Eastertide weeks on resurrection virtues. I think it has something to do with the resurrection virtue of temperance. Now, temperance, you may know again about from your knowledge of American history. The temperance movement, led in particular by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, worked for the legalization and for the adoption of the constitutional amendment that brought about prohibition. The prohibition on the sale and making and use of and basically anything related to alcohol that was in place from 1920 to 1933. It came about in the 18th Amendment. Now, why exactly were these Christians, and particularly these Christian women, so focused on temperance? Temperance in that sense and in that moment was just one part of a complex social movement that was concerned with social justice in a variety of forms, for rights for laborers and wage justice, for women's suffrage. The 18th Amendment was prohibition. The 19th granted women the right to vote. There was a sense that things should be made better, more holy, and that the abuses of both the poor and women that came out of the abuses of alcohol needed to be limited. Complete prohibition seemed the best route. That social movement actually saw the birth of reactionary modern fundamentalism. This was where you first started to see a renewed interest and concern against women speaking out in church, where women had been ordained in a variety of Christian communities. Now there were certain churches that were speaking out, saying, oh no, they were not supposed to be speaking or preaching, lest they start talking from the pulpit about women having the right to vote or suggesting that you shouldn't drink anymore. Now, granted, legal prohibition turned out not to be the right strategy for temperance. And indeed, during those years of prohibition, we saw a spike in crime and violence, the birth of the modern mafia. What joys. Chicago found itself on the map, finally, for our criminal presence in the world. But temperance is not about prohibition, nor controlling others, or even really ourselves. That's not what a Christian virtue is about. Certainly no resurrection virtue is about control or power. Rather, theologian and ethicist Stanley Hauerwas talks about who is Mike's favorite, and I have to just point out that I am quoting him from the pulpit, because usually it's Mike. Thank you. He handed me the book with a Post-it note, but nevertheless, here it is. Hauerwas talks about how temperance is about shaping our desires and shaping those of others. It's about retelling narratives and stories about ourselves, considering what we want, what we think is good and right. We are, of course, also in this Memorial Day weekend in which our nation commemorates the dead. And of course, we also grieve in this time and long for peace. In 907, if you came in this way, the kids drew prayers for peace on the walkway. Some of them are more clearly about peace than others. But we talked about this longing. Memorial Day did not come first commemorating the dead of just any war, but following the Civil War, which indeed was a fight for freedom. Our narratives since then as a nation have come to see any military action or any war in which our nation is involved as a fight for freedom. But the truth, as usual, is more complex than that. We have a narrative in our country that freedom can only be won or protected by military might, by violent force. At the same time, we have a narrative that the Civil War was less about freedom for those who had lived in enslavement, those Black Americans who had been persecuted for centuries by slavery and by the people who enslaved them and profited off their lives and labor. We can tell a story that no, actually the Civil War was really about economics. And it's funny because in some ways it was about economics. People in the Confederacy did not wish to lose their ability to make vast sums of money off the lives and labors of other human people. They put their concern about their personal economics over what was right and good. I've been reading a lot, actually, about that period in American history and reading about the ways in which even especially Christians spoke of Black Americans in that time. And it is clear that this was not simply about, oh, well, we just need this to make money, and the industrialized North doesn't rely on slavery in quite the same way. It is striking and terrible to see the language that is used for people of color. They are seen and spoken of as less than human. And we know that that is wrong. We know that all people are created in the image of God and should be free to live and choose and shape their own destinies. So we have this story about freedom. We have this story about what is good. We have this story about how our country is meant to live together. Hauerwas reminds us that the stories we tell shape our desires, and that it is the call of Christians to shape our desires towards what is good. If you have been reading the news this week, you have seen a lot of language about women's desires and women's desires that end in pregnancy, and the choices that they have if those pregnancies are undesired. New laws have been passed in a variety of states suggesting that, or making it all but difficult to terminate those pregnancies, even under any circumstances. And there have been responses, defenses of those laws that simply say, well, if women don't wish to be pregnant, then they should just abstain from the sorts of activities that will make you get pregnant. As if that is always an option, as if that is always something in people's control. And so I worry a little bit about Hauerwas's language about shaping our desires, because that kind of language is sometimes used as a prohibition for people. Shape your desires away from being gay. Shape your desires away from premarital relationships. Shape your desires. But we've learned from history, if not our own personal experience, that prohibition usually doesn't work. Certainly not in prohibiting others. We are created to be free. 3,000 years ago, God puts before the people a choice. Choose this. We think about freedom and choice not only in military terms in our country, but often in economic ones. And I feel like we don't hear this as much anymore, but it used to be that when we were hearing about the terrible life under the Soviet Union, we were not just hearing about, how oppressive the regime was. We were hearing about how you never got to choose what kind of bread you wanted in the grocery store, as if choosing your band of bread is the greatest freedom. It's important. I like the Sara Lee whole grain white. It's nice, it's soft, it's healthy. There was an article, though, in The Atlantic this week talking about how our choices, our economic choices, have become so unlimited that for many of us, they are out of control. They are not a sign of life or human flourishing. Go to Amazon, the writer suggests, and type in hangers. Hangers. And there are basically two types, the sort of velvet-covered ones or the metal ones. They come in different package sizes, but for the most part, they all have the same number of enthusiastic reviews. They hang clothes well. They all can get to you in the same period of time, and yet the providers of these are endless. They are myriad. There are so many hangers out there. The author cites this statistic that even since 2004, the amount of products available for sale has grown exponentially. There is so much stuff, and we are free to buy it. But maybe, as Christians, we ought to be shaping our desires differently. Maybe we might think of what is good in life as not having endless options or accumulating things, of having enough money to purchase whatever we want when we want it. Maybe choosing life is about a different sort of prosperity. There was another story told this week at Morehouse College, which is a historically black college and is wonderful. A lot of Morehouse men go to the University of Chicago Divinity School, and we like them there. They're great guys. But there was a graduation speaker there this week, and in his commencement address, he announced that he would pay off the student loans of all the students gathered there who were graduating in that class. And it was like, it was like a huge amount of money, multiple millions of dollars. And that was a wonderful thing. Surely we all longed to be Morehouse students that day, as some of us will be paying off our student debts for hundreds of years. At least until Fiona goes to college. So we long to be Morehouse students that day. But other people raised the question, what does it mean in a society in which we might consider Christian virtues, in which we tell stories about what is good? What does it mean that one person has enough money to cover the debt of all of those and still have even more? What does it mean that one person should have so much prosperity and others so little? As we consider the prosperity that is promised to the people of Israel when they choose life, when we consider what it means for us to choose life, it is good to remember that prosperity in the Bible, that flourishing in the narrative of God, is always tied to the well-being of all, and particularly the most vulnerable. As we consider how our political order is shaped, how our legislation reflects whether or not people can pursue their freedom, can pursue their own flourishing, when we consider what our economic order means, not just for us, but how we live together, what it means for others, what it means for the environment. With all those hangers, I wonder how many of them end up on that garbage island that's floating around the oceans. It is good for us, as we remember those who die and give their lives, as those who risk everything for freedom. It is good for us to consider what it means for us as people of God to choose life. I enjoyed Hauerwas's essay more than I thought. Don't tell, Mike, so I'll get stuck forever. But I encountered another one this week as well from Wendell Berry, who is beloved as a Christian writer by many. And he often writes, and indeed this essay is from his agrarian essays, and as a lifelong city and suburb dweller, I have no great desire to go live on the farm to find God. And yet, I am moved by his words. We have lived by the assumption that what was good for us would be good for the world. We have fulfilled the danger of this by making our personal pride and greed the standard of our behavior toward the world, to the incalculable disadvantage of the world and every living thing in it. And now, perhaps very close to too late, our great error has become clear. It is not only our own creativity, our own capacity for life that is stifled by this assumption. The creation itself is stifled. We have been wrong. We must change our lives so that it will be possible to live by the contrary assumption that what is good for the world will be good for us. And that requires that we make the effort to know the world, and I would add, to know other people, to hear their stories, and to learn what is good for it and them. As we seek to be more temperate people, as we seek to grow in the love and knowledge of God, May we hear the stories of others. May we hear the groaning of creation. May we look at the ways that the stories that we tell and the laws that we pass affect others. May we listen, and may we shape our desires ever more fully towards the good of all people, towards life in God. Amen.